Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I am Gary Machida, and this is part two of our treatment of the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah argument, which is one of the most popular arguments out there for the Protestant canon and against the Deuterocanonical books. And as we showed in the last video, that first premise is very likely wrong, that Jesus is not referring to Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, who's found in 2nd Chronicles. There are actually many other candidates, and actually better candidates that square up much better with the biblical data than the son of Jehoiada. And that kind of leaves us with a little bit of a conundrum, because if that is true, then why do scholars opt for the son of Jehoiada? And the answer is the second premise. It's precisely because of the belief in the second premise that lends weight to the son of Jehoiada as opposed to any other candidate. And that's why the blood of Abel argument tends to be circular. It's the first premise more or less rests on the second premise. And as we'll soon see, the second premise actually relies more on the first. So without further ado, why don't we dive into that second premise? Was Chronicles the last book of the Bible? Stay tuned, folks. Fasten your seatbelts, because we're about to enter the Apocrypha Apocalypse. Okay, let's look at the second premise. Now, of course, the blood of Abel argument, the bookends argument, argues as follows: that Jesus refers to Abel, whose martyrdom is recorded in Genesis, and he refers to Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, whose martyrdom is in 2nd Chronicles. And then the second premise is, well, 2nd Chronicles is the last book of the rabbinic canon. Therefore, according to the traditional order, Jesus, therefore, is affirming the rabbinic Bible, which excluded the Deuterocanonical books. But how solid is this? Is there evidence to substantiate a first century order that Chronicles was the last book in the writings, that third division of rabbinic scripture? Well, in order to determine that, we need to look at the evidence. And so what I'd like to do is give you an overview of the evidence, and you could determine for yourself just how well substantiated this second premise truly is. Now, to begin with, we're going to look at the rabbinic document known as Bava Batra 14b. This is a document, a Jewish document that was composed around the 2nd Christian century. So this is well after the time of Jesus, and it records the following tradition, and I'll give you a little snippet of the end. It says, quote, Ezra recorded his book and the genealogies of Chronicles up to his time. This supports Rav, as Rabbi Judah said. Quote, Rav said, Ezra did not go up from Babylonia until he recorded his genealogy, and then he went up. And who concluded the book of Chronicles? Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. So basically, in terms of data composition, the book of Chronicles is last, according to Bava Batra. Now, something else you should know about Bava Batra is that this document is not found amongst the codified oral traditions of the Jews, and the earliest, which is known as the Tanaic period. It's known as a Barita. And as Dr. Lee McDonald, who is a Baptist, who has done lots of great work in the Old Testament canon research, he states that, quote, this tradition is classified as a Barita from the Tanaic period and did not find a place in the Mishnah, suggests that the text had not yet received widespread approval by the closure and codification of the Mishnah around 200 CE. In other words, Dr. McDonald suggesting that because it was not included in the Mishnah, that even in the second Christian century, this particular document was not well received amongst the Jews. So I know there's been a little bit of pushback on this point. I'm not going to really emphasize it, but it's something that you should be aware of. Okay, so what else do we have as far as evidence? Well, Bava Bathra is not the earliest evidence. We actually have Christian lists. And some lists actually are either around the time this document was made or even earlier. And among the most important of Christian lists are those early church fathers who were attempting to reproduce the rabbinic canon and order of the books. So that's going to be the major focus of this survey, is to see, is there any evidence that the Jews in antiquity actually placed Chronicles at the end of their Hebrew Bible? So let's look at the list. I highlight those that are deliberately trying to reproduce the rabbinic order, starting with Melito of Sardis in AD 170. Now, this is a few decades before Bava Bathra was written, and he ends his list with Daniel, Ezekiel, and Ezra and Nehemiah. A little bit later in 240, we have Origen of Alexandria. He also was trying to reproduce the list of the rabbis. He ends with Daniel, Job, and Esther. The same thing's true with Hilary of Poitiers. He ends with Ezekiel, Job, and Esther. So earliest testimony testifies to Ezra, Nehemiah, or Esther being at the end of the Bible. The rest that are not highlighted are just Christian lists. And as you can see, none of them have Chronicles. They almost all end with Daniel, 12 minor prophets, or Esther. Moving on, we have Epiphanius, who gives two lists where he tries to reproduce the rabbinic Bible, and also Jerome. And as you can see, there is agreement where Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the last two books in the writings or the Hebrew Old Testament. After that, you have Augustine, Third Carthage, Rufinus, so on and so forth. There is an odd thing here in Pope St. Innocent I's list in 405. He actually ends with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But if you actually look at the list, you'll see that it's an eclectic list. His groupings really don't square with any kind of traditional order. He's certainly not trying to reproduce the rabbinical order. So the fact that he ends with Chronicles is kind of serendipitous. It's just chance. It really doesn't have any evidentiary value. But nevertheless, I wanted to point that out. Continuing on, Isidore of Seville, John of Damascus, both end with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther at the end. And that's what we have from the early church as far as antiquity. No one ends with Chronicles. Now, moving on to codices. Well, what's a codex? A codex is basically the ancient version of a modern book. It's a book of books. And so it's very important in that codices allows us to see the contents of what would be included in the bound Bible. And there are two very important Hebrew codices. Hebrew codices Aleppo, which is known as the Aleppo Codex, also the Leningrad Codex, which is now called the St. Petersburg Codex. Aleppo comes from the 10th century. The Leningrad St. Peter's comes from the 11th century, very beginning of the 11th century. Two very venerable texts. Both of them end with Ezra and Nehemiah. Then this is followed by a document, a Devarim, which is written in 1207. It too concludes with Ezra and Nehemiah. Actually, we will talk a little bit about that in depth in a little bit. Then finally, we have some evidence of Chronicles being placed at the end of the Bible in 1246. And then you can see there's a few in the 1200s that include Chronicles at the end. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, Chronicles again, Ezra and Nehemiah. And then once you get to the 1400s, 1500s, Chronicles becomes uniform, especially with the printed editions. Now, let's summarize really quick what the evidence shows us. First, Bava Bathra alone gives Chronicles last in antiquity. Every early Christian writer who attempted to reproduce the rabbinic order ended either with Ezra and Nehemiah or with Esther not with Chronicles. The oldest Hebrew codices end with Ezra and Nehemiah, not Chronicles. Chronicles does not appear at the end of the Hebrew codices until the 1200s. That's right, almost a millennium after Bava Bathra. Let's look at that document that I mentioned earlier, Adeth Dabarim, because it has something very interesting to say about the status of the order in the early 1200s. Okay, it says this, quote, "Know, God give thee the understanding that the Hagiographa, or the writings, are divided into 11 sections: Chronicles, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, and Ezra. But the Babylonians have altered this order. Some place Chronicles at the end of the volume, and others place the scroll of Esther at the end of the volume." Now, that's very interesting because this document is saying that there is a tradition from Babylon, actually two traditions, it's not united, that the Babylonians either place Chronicles at the end or they place Esther at the end. Now, we intend to begin with the first of these books, Chronicles, according to the order of the land of Israel. For this is the right and true one, and all who copy the Holy Scriptures in Babylonia and elsewhere will return to this order. So, very important document. Right when we start seeing in the codices, Chronicles being placed near the end of the Bible, this document comes up and it says basically there is a tradition from Israel, the right true tradition, places Chronicles first, and it ends with Ezra and Nehemiah. And the Babylonians have two different traditions, one where they have Chronicles last and the other one where they have Esther last. Timothy Stone comments about this, quote, "The evidence is late and scant, but from what survived the Talmudic and Masoretic orders for the writings in the Jewish tradition are the only two attested prior to the 12th century CE. In the case of Bava Bathra 14b, the Talmudic order, which places Chronicles last, is not found again until the 12th century. From the end of the 9th century, the Masoretic order, which places Chronicles first, alone is well attested for at least the next 200 years. He continues, following the decline of the Masoretes in the 11th century CE, the writing stability eventually gave way to a variety of orders. This does not mean that there was not an ancient order or orders that remained fixed for some time. In this context, in the 12th century CE, when the order of the writings is being unmoored, Adeth Dabarim reveals the utmost concern to preserve the right and true order of the Masoretes, which is according to the land of Israel, as opposed to those from Babylon and elsewhere, which place Chronicles or Esther last. Eisfeld and others, arguing from the Palestinian origin for this order, gained some support, albeit extremely late, from Adeth Dabarim, and most importantly, from the questionable nature of the hypotheses that the Masoretic order developed from the Talmudic. All available evidence supports the idea that the Masoretes faithfully preserved the ancient traditions, unquote. So what's he saying? He's talking about Adeth Dabarim, and he basically says that Masoretic order that actually placed Ezra and Nehemiah last and Chronicles first among the writings, that has the Masoretes have faithfully preserved the ancient traditions. So that's what Adeth Dabarim says, and this also squares with what we've seen in terms of the evidence from List and also from codices. Who was the first to ever introduce the canonical interpretation of Luke 11 and Matthew 23? Who was the first to give the blood of Abel bookend argument? Well, this might surprise you because you might think, well, certainly one of the early church fathers in antiquity proposed it. Perhaps somebody in the Middle Ages proposed it, some medieval scholar. Maybe the first was a Protestant reformer or one of the Protestant divines, maybe an Anglican divine. No, the first person in history to take Jesus's words in Luke 11 and Matthew 23 and hook that up to this idea that Chronicles was the last book of the rabbinic Bible. The first person in history to do that is none other than Johann Eichhorn in 1780. Just think about that. The first person to put these two things together. And you have to ask yourself, why did it take until 1780 before anybody was able to read these texts and say, oh, well, that Zechariah is in 2nd Chronicles, and 2nd Chronicles is the last book of the Bible? Well, the fact is that by the 18th century, at the end, every printed edition of the Hebrew Scriptures listed Chronicles as the last book. In other words, it became so predominant in libraries that Chronicles is listed at the end that Eichhorn could look at these texts and put two and two together and say, oh, wait, hold on a second. 2nd Chronicles is the last book in the Bible. Okay, so the tradition of placing Chronicles as the last book in the Bible doesn't come from antiquity. It doesn't come from the Reformation. It doesn't come from the Counter-Reformation or anything like that. It really is a printer's tradition. It is the publishing houses had traditionally placed 2nd Chronicles at the end of their printed editions of the Hebrew text. And by the time Eichhorn comes on the scene, all available printed editions likely ended with 2nd Chronicles. And so that gave him the idea, well, Jesus probably is using it because of that. However, this is very important because on the web, often when the second premise is given, they will say according to the traditional order, but they never explain what exactly is the traditional order. Where does it come from? Anything like that. It's just kind of given, oh, according to the traditional order. Well, you know what? The traditional order that they're referring to is the tradition of printers made basically from the 1400s onwards. And we saw that with our codices. It was really the 1400s onward and mass production of printing happening that Chronicles uniformly becomes placed at the end of every scholar's Bible. And so that kind of lends a sort of credibility to the second premise. But the problem is, like I said, it's a printer's tradition. It has no backing in antiquity. Now, what's really interesting is if you read Eichhorn's work, he acknowledges, in fact, he had to acknowledge that two things which ultimately undermine the second premise. First, he admits that the ancients likely did not have a fixed order of their books. He states, quote, perhaps as little in ancient as in modern times was the precise identical position of single books in general series universally observed. And he also acknowledges, interesting enough, that there are Spanish codices that place Ezra Nehemiah last. This is different from the German practice because he says, quote, the Germans, however, adhere to the order of the Talmud. So you're probably asking yourself, well, with these very important qualifications, how in the world, Johann, did you come up with a solid affirmation that Second Chronicles must be the last book in the Bible and that Jesus must be referring to it because of that fact? Well, not surprisingly, he relies on circular reasoning. In other words, he reasons that Jesus chose Second Chronicles because it was the last book, and Second Chronicles is the last book because Jesus chose it. Okay, do you see the circularity there? In other words, he assumes that Second Chronicles was the last book, and then based on the assumption, he looks at the text and says, yep, that's why Jesus chose it, because he chose it, because it was the last book. Circular reasoning, folks. And that's why whenever the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah argument's given, you always have this kind of strange circularity. And we mentioned this last video where the first premise really has to lean a little bit on the truth of the second premise. And guess what? The second premise also has to lean a little bit on the first premise. But the problem is it's like building a castle in midair. There's just no foundation for it. So let's review all the evidence. Was Chronicles the last book? Well, There's only one list in all of antiquity that places Chronicles last. That's Bava Bathra, of course, excluding Pope St. Innocent's eccentric list. All Christian lists that attempted to reproduce the rabbinic canon in order ended with Ezra, Nehemiah, or Esther. Actually confirms the accuracy of these Christian lists when they're trying to figure out what was in the rabbinic Bible. Why? Because it confirms the Palestinian order, all those early church fathers that ended their list with Ezra and Nehemiah, and it also confirms one of the Babylonian orders, namely placing Esther at the end. But notice, no early church father confirms the existence of that second Babylonian tradition that places Chronicles last. That's a very important point. Also, the two great Hebrew codices, Aleppo and St. Petersburg, place Ezra and Nehemiah last. The earliest Hebrew codex that exist come from the 1200s that place Chronicles last. Also, Adat Dabarim, which was written roughly around the same time. There was this confusion about the ordering. It claims that the Israelite order of Ezra and Nehemiah is the true and right order. And it also claims that the Babylonian tradition was divided on the last book, either Esther or Chronicles. Finally, the canonical interpretation was first proposed in 1780 by Johann Eichhorn. Again, the only reason why it pops up on the radar screen so late in Christian history is because of the invention of the printing press. It's not because of ancient pedigree of placing Second Chronicles last. Now, to conclude, I want to throw this argument out. It's not something that I want to put a lot of weight on, but I think you ought to know about it. If you ever read the end of Second Chronicles, you'll notice that the last few verses are almost identical to the first few verses found in Ezra. Scholars have speculated as to how this occurred and why it occurred. One possible theory, which I think has some good weight behind it, is that at one time during the transmission of the text, Second Chronicles was actually attached to Ezra and Nehemiah. So it actually was one document. Hence, the last verses of Second Chronicles is almost identical to Ezra, because at some point in history, the two texts were separated, and so it needed to repeat those two things. Now, it's just a theory, but if it's true, then we actually have scriptural evidence that Second Chronicles could not be the last book in the Rabbinic Bible, at least not historically. Why? Because Ezra and Nehemiah had to have followed it because of this strange linkage in the text. It's just something that I want you to be aware of. Okay, so in summary, first premise, the son of Jehoiada is most likely not Jesus' Zechariah. There are other and better candidates that better fit the biblical data besides him. So chances are Jesus is not referring to Zechariah, the martyr recorded in Second Chronicles. Moreover, the second premise is absolutely not substantiated. Outside of a single second century witness, all the evidence from antiquity to the 13th century points to either Ezra, Nehemiah, or Esther being the last, not Chronicles. Okay. So that being said, there's also a problem with the conclusion. In other words, even if you assume the truth of those two premises, the conclusion also doesn't necessarily follow. Now, follow me on this. The conclusion that Jesus sanctioned the rabbinic canon, which excluded the deuterocanonical books, is faulty for the following reasons. The canonical interpretation would be a possible interpretation, but it's not the only possible interpretation. In other words, there's other perfectly reasonable interpretations that could be true, yet it doesn't mean that Jesus endorsed a canon. Okay. For example, Jesus may have chose Abel and Zechariah because they're the first and last prophets to be martyred at this point in salvation history. If that's true, then it's possible that there were prophets after Second Chronicles, after the son of Jehoiada was martyred, and maybe even they wrote scripture, but they wouldn't be included in Jesus's list. Why? Because they weren't martyred by their kinsmen. So even if this is true, it doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus is referring or adopting the rabbinic canon. Moreover, as we mentioned in part 1, another possible reason for the pairing of Abel with the son of Jehoiada is that these two martyrdoms are singled out in the biblical text as martyrdoms that particularly call out for God's retribution. And this fits perfectly with the context in Luke 11 and also Matthew 23, because Jesus is saying all this falls upon the heads of this generation of you. So that means that even if Jesus is referring to the son of Jehoiada, who is mentioned in 2 Chronicles, it may not have anything to do with 2 Chronicles, and therefore it may have nothing to do with the canon. And these are live options. You can't rule these out. Moreover, there's also an unspoken assumption that the deuterocanonical books would have been excluded from the traditional order of the Tanakh. Okay. Why do I say that? Well, in my book, The Case for the Deuterocanon, I give evidence that from both Christian and Jewish sources that the Deuterocanon was copied and included amongst the writings, that third division of the rabbinic scriptures, long after their authority had been denied by the rabbis. And this means that they could have been within the parameters of the law and the prophets and the writings. And therefore, even if Jesus did single out 2 Chronicles as the last of the writings, it doesn't necessarily exclude the Deuterocanon. So even if you accept all these premises and assumptions, you still don't end up with what this argument's trying to do, namely come up with an argument that affirms the Protestant Old Testament and denies the Deuterocanon. It just doesn't get you there, folks. And so I hope that you found this helpful, and thanks for watching. Thank you so much for watching, and if you haven't done already, please subscribe, like, do all those social media type things because we appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to support me on Patreon, look me up by my name, Gary Machuda, and you will have access to a lot of other information, in-depth research, not only on the Deuterocanon, but other topics as well, like Mary, Purgatory, all sorts of things. So check it out, folks. And again, thank you so much for watching. And God willing, we'll be back again soon. Bye-bye.